Between 1962 and 1964, a series of brutal murders terrorized the city of Boston, leaving the authorities and the public alike on edge. The killer's MO was consistent, targeting single, older women. Despite a massive manhunt and countless leads, the killer remained at large, and the case soon became one of the most baffling and controversial in history. In this video, we will explore the details of this case, sift through the evidence, and present our conclusion on who this killer was. So, sit back and join us on this gripping journey into the mind of a murderer as we examine one of the most notorious and mysterious serial killers in American history, the Boston Strangler. On a warm June evening in 1962, Anna Slezers, a 55-year-old Latvian seamstress who lived alone, was settling into her apartment in the quiet Boston suburb of Beacon Hill. Little did she know that an intruder was already lurking in the shadows outside, waiting for the right moment to strike. The assailant entered into Anna's apartment through an unlocked window, and Anna was quickly subdued. The unknown intruder bound her hands and feet with a cord and sexually assaulted her before finally strangling her to death. When the police arrived on the scene, they were baffled by the brutality of the crime and the lack of any discernible motive. Little did the police know that this was only the first of a series of killings by someone who would become infamously known as the Boston Strangler. Over the next 2 years, a string of murders would terrorize the city of Boston and forever leave a mark on American history. A few months after the first killing, several other women were murdered in a similar fashion, including 68-year-old Nina Nichols and 75-year-old Ida Erga. More killings followed, all by similar methods and style, and all within and around the Boston area. It was quickly clear to law enforcement that they had a serial killer on the loose. The Boston Police Department formed a special task force to investigate the murders, which included over 2,000 suspects at one point. However, they struggled to find any leads or evidence that could lead them to the killer. The investigation was further complicated by false confessions, media attention, and public pressure to solve the case. Despite the tireless efforts of law enforcement, the killer remained at large, while the police received media scrutiny, taunting letters, accusatory phone calls, and investigative leads that didn't pan out. The lack of progress only served to sow fear in the hearts of Bostonians. As the Boston Strangler continued to evade police, desperate investigators began to consider increasingly unusual suspects. In the midst of this manhunt, another killing occurred which appeared to match the Strangler MO. A suspect with an extensive criminal record and drinking problem was quickly identified. A man named Roy Smith. On March 11, 1963, Bessie Goldberg was found strangled to death in her home in Belmont, Massachusetts. That same day, Smith had been sent to Goldberg's home by the Division of Employment Security to help her clean. Several eyewitnesses saw Smith entering and leaving Goldberg's home within the time frame of the murder. These facts, along with Smith's criminal record, and the fact that it appeared Smith left the home in a hurry due to it remaining largely uncleaned, led to his arrest and conviction for the murder. With Smith's conviction, Goldberg was never included in the list of Boston Strangler victims. Even though Goldberg fit the victim profile, the cause of death was the same, and it occurred within the same relative area as the other killings. These facts initially led police to believe it was another Strangler murder. In fact, upon identifying Smith as the primary suspect, police were strongly considering him to be the infamous Boston Strangler himself, until it was revealed that Smith had been incarcerated during many of the killings. However, there are many who believe Smith didn't kill Goldberg either, and that he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. To this day, there is still debate on whether or not Smith murdered Goldberg or if Goldberg was another Strangler victim. Another suspect was a man named George Nasser, who actually claimed to have heard the confession of the real Boston Strangler while in prison for a different murder from a man named Albert DeSalvo. However, Nasser was not only a twice convicted murderer himself, but coincidentally was incarcerated right before the killings ceased in 1964. Nasser was a 37-year-old salesman living in the Boston area at the time of the Strangler murders. Many considered him a credible suspect because of his murder convictions, and because a possible Strangler witness identified him as a possible suspect. Nasser also had a history of mental illness and was known to have made disturbing comments about women and sex. Nasser also lived in the same neighborhood as some of the victims and frequented bars in the area where they were last seen. Despite these circumstantial connections, there was never any direct physical evidence linking Nasser to the murders. His fingerprints did not match any of the prints found at any of the crime scenes, and there was nothing ever found connecting him to the crimes. Nonetheless, Nasser remained as a viable suspect as the police desperately searched for any evidence that could put him at one of the crime scenes during the murders. It was only after police looked more closely at the man that Nasser said had admitted to being the Strangler, a man who later provided a full confession to the 13 Strangler murders, that Nasser was ultimately eliminated as a suspect completely. That man was Albert DeSalvo. While DeSalvo confessed to being the Boston Strangler, there is still controversy over the validity of his confession. First, DeSalvo eventually recanted his confession, later being arrested on unrelated sexual assault charges and sentenced to life in prison. Additionally, DeSalvo was one of many who came forward throughout the years who confessed to being the Strangler. Oddly enough, after DeSalvo's imprisonment, no additional killings were ever attributed to the Boston Strangler. However, at the time of his confession, much like other suspects, police had no physical evidence linking DeSalvo to the crime scenes. Adding more complication to the investigation, DeSalvo was eventually killed in prison in 1973, again denying that he was the Strangler right before his death. It would be many years before police believed they knew the actual identity of the killer, and that belief was tied to evidence obtained from the final known killing of the infamous serial killer. It was a humid August night in 1964 when Mary Sullivan returned to her apartment in the Beacon Hill neighborhood of Boston. Little did she know that an intruder was already inside, waiting for her. The assailant quickly overpowered Mary and strangled her to death, leaving behind a particularly gruesome crime scene, as she had been strangled with her own stockings and raped. As police investigated the murder, they were struck by the similarities between this killing and the others that had been happening in the area in the past few years. It was quickly evident to investigators that the Strangler had claimed another victim. However, what the police did not know at the time was that this would be the final killing in the series of murders attributed to the Boston Strangler. It was the evidence recovered from Mary's body in 1964 that would ultimately provide the crucial breakthrough in the Strangler case. Despite DNA evidence being a tool still decades away, investigators had the foresight to preserve a sample of semen found on her body, which was later analyzed many years later, using newly developed DNA techniques. However, before this could happen, there would be many other theories and twists to this case. Mary Sullivan's body was exhumed by her nephew in 2001, where DNA of DeSalvo was searched for but not found. This gave credence to the theory that the identity of the Strangler was still unknown. It would be another 12 years before police had access to advanced enough DNA technology, along with sufficient evidence to exhume another body for testing. This new test would convince police beyond a shadow of a doubt that they finally knew the identity of the Boston Strangler. Going on the theory that DeSalvo was the killer, police conducted surveillance on DeSalvo's nephew. When the opportunity arose, police were able to recover a discarded water bottle belonging to DeSalvo's nephew and were able to compare the DNA on that bottle to that of the semen sample recovered from Mary Sullivan's murder. The comparison revealed a male familial match, meaning that a male in the nephew's family was likely the person who left the semen at the final crime scene. Using this, investigators were able to obtain a court order to exhume DeSalvo's body in 2013. Using the latest forensic DNA testing available, criminologists were able to show with 99% certainty that the semen found at the last crime scene did, in fact, belong to Albert DeSalvo. Despite this revelation, there are many who still doubt DeSalvo as being the strangler, while others believe he only actually murdered Sullivan, but not the other victims. Because of this, in the many years it took to reach a conclusion with many other credible suspects, the Boston Strangler case remains one of the most notorious unsolved mysteries in American history. While the identity of the killer may never be definitively proven, the legacy of fear and tragedy left behind by his crimes will continue to haunt Boston for generations to come. So what do we at C4 Detective think about this case? Who do we think the Boston Strangler was? Well, like many of our investigation stories, answering this question isn't as clear-cut as some might like. To start, 13 murders over 18 months are associated with the Boston Strangler, as they all had very similar MOs, with 11 of those being the most similar in style. Of those murders, with the exception of the DNA recovered from the last victim, very few pieces of physical evidence linking any one person to the crimes were actually found. Additionally, there are indications that at least some of the killings may have not been committed by DeSalvo. Despite strangulation being the cause of death, there are inconsistent patterns at the various crime scenes and victims. One of the most obvious is that while most of the victims were older women, this was not always the case, such as with the final victim linked to DeSalvo, Mary Sullivan, only being 19 years old. There were also other potential strangler victims, such as Bessie Goldberg, who fit the initial pattern of victims more than others, but who was not included in the list of strangler victims due to the arrest of Roy Smith for the crime. All of these inconsistencies, along with a lack of direct evidence linking all of the victims, has led some experts to believe there may have been multiple killers. That being said, there are several pieces of circumstantial evidence which do actually help paint the picture for most of the victims in our opinion. Based on this, we at C4 Detective believe the likely culprit is Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo not only confessed to 13 murders, but he was also living in the area of the murders at the time. He also knew key details from some of the crime scenes that had not been publicly released. Even if he didn't commit all of them, he likely committed several based on the similarities found at the crime scenes, along with his criminal history and intimate knowledge of facts not provided to the public. Additionally, killings with the precise MO of the Strangler notably ceased upon DeSalvo's arrest for his other crimes. These facts, along with the definitive DNA evidence linking him to the final crime scene, provide proof beyond a reasonable doubt for his guilt in our expert opinion. While there are many more theories and suspects in the Strangler case, it is important to know that in most criminal cases, there isn't a vast conspiracy with multiple twists and turns. The existence of overly dramatic books, movies, and TV shows makes it very easy to let our imaginations get the better of us. The philosophy of Occam's razor is usually appropriate in every case. The simplest solution is likely the correct one. We can see this in DeSalvo himself as a suspect, as until 2013, there was still an active effort within the public to clear his name completely until the DNA evidence definitively linked him to Mary Sullivan's murder. While no one was ever tried for the Boston Strangler murders, we only hope that the likely proof of DeSalvo's guilt can bring some comfort and closure to the victims' families, despite the identity of the killer for some still remaining shrouded in controversy. It is also our hope that the fact DeSalvo died in prison brings some sense of justice to these brutal crimes. Regardless, for the victims, justice came too late, and the memory of their tragic deaths lingers on to this day. Thanks for watching. Do you have a suggestion or evidence you want to provide to C4 Detective to help us discover more? Contact us and we may do a follow-up to this video. And if you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you investigation videos. It's the only thing that allows us to continue bringing you the truth.